My wife and I are going through Judges, and every single judge, every single story I read, I'm like, oh man, this is like Trump. And just the next story, oh, this is like Trump. More. And I finally realized that it's not about Trump. It's about us, Christians. The Bible wasn't given to us so that we could fix countries, change people's behavior, or things like that, which is what we want to do in the political field. The Bible was given to us to change our hearts so that we will have a right standing relationship with God. Well, have a right relationship with God that will give us a good heart. I'm really sorry if my thoughts get scattered. I promise you it's going to kind of tie together at the end. I finally started to understand Samson. Started to really wrestle through that story. That story is not a simple story. It's not just... I went and looked up on Google Images. I put Samson in, and not every single one depicts him as this big, strong guy. And he was never that. And I remember I'm reading I can't remember the chapter now. I want to say maybe chapter 15. The one where he finally is starting to fall for Delilah and he loses his strength. Where he breaks his covenant with God. Now, she says in that chapter, because she got ahead of me a little bit, she said, oh man, it's painfully obvious how he's not big and strong in muscles. And I was like, oh, okay. She goes, but I'm not going to tell you. I was like, oh. So I'm reading it and I'm just like, what in the world is it? And it turns out that I read the whole thing and I could not figure it out. And I went back and I read the commentary and it's like, yeah, well, they were trying to figure out the source of his strength. And because why would you try to figure out the source of somebody's strength if it wasn't for the fact that they didn't look strong at all, that it wasn't their muscles? So obviously he wasn't strong because they wouldn't be looking for the source of his strength if he had big old muscles. We as Christians, man, we really need to dive into our scripture and read it for ourselves and try to better understand these stories, because it really, especially in Judges, just shows a different side of God that is true, is always completely true. It adds to the complexity of who God is. And as I finished Samson, I realized, wow, I had so many misunderstandings about who Samson was. And that would have all been fixed if I would have actually studied my Bible and read it for myself, instead of just going off of what other people think. Because I looked around, I Googled images of Samson, and all the interpretations have him as big old muscles, as I said before. And there's a movie that's coming out on PureFlix, and I'm like, they made a whole movie that I'm just gonna guess is really gonna misrepresent Samson. Because Samson is a very confusing person. Why in the world is he in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews when he doesn't do anything, right? But there's one little sentence that he says before he dies. And he says arguably two sentences. So he got it 50-50, right and wrong. The first sentence, he's like, he finally acknowledges that his strength has come from God alone. And he asks for strength. And then he goes and screws it up by going, well, I just want the strength really to get revenge because it took my eyes out. It's not for your sovereignty, God. It's not for your glory. It's not for your honor. It's not because anything else. It's not going because, oh, well, they're oppressing us as a whole nation. No. Samson could care less about the whole nation of Israel. He cares about his two eyes that have constantly gotten him in trouble. Even without his eyes, he's still... his eyes get him in trouble. And even without them, they still get him in trouble. Like, it's crazy. And that adds to the complexity of people. It shows that there are certain things that you want to imitate of people in the Bible, but you never want to be just like them. They are all broken. The only person you really want to be like is Jesus. And it makes it more painfully obvious the more you read scripture, finally. And you see like, oh man, every single champion of the faith that we like, they're complex. They're flawed. And that's why we needed Jesus, because even the best of them messed up big time. This is what I am personally learning. This is what I really reflected on today. So I'm reading all of this stuff, and I'm kind of constantly thinking about Trump. And I go, okay, when you read scripture, you're not supposed to be applying it to other people. You're always supposed to apply it to yourself. And so I go, okay, now I've realized that this is not about Trump's fault. This is not all Trump's fault. This is actually Christians' fault. And I'm a Christian, so how is this pointing to me? I'm not here to point at other Christians and say like, oh, well, this is how other Christians are having problems. I shouldn't do that. But hopefully you will learn from what God is pointing toward me. That's what I do hope, because it's everybody's fault. With all bad leaders like Samson and all these other judges that just show, man, bad leader after bad leader, God is using them to do his will, but they're not good leaders. It could have been done way better. And sometimes the leaders don't even care about God at all. Sometimes I heard somebody say, I wonder if Samson's even going to be in heaven, because like he cared nothing for God until the very end. But he's in the Faith Hall of Fame, so I guess so. But it's a reflection on Israel itself, not on the leader. And so if we are going to complain about our leader of our country, that is a reflection on our people. That's us. That means that the reason we have Trump, and even the Christians who are like, hey, I disagree with Trump completely, but I've been a Republican since the beginning, blah, da, 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 da. We still have to point out that it's Christianity, it's Christians. We have brought this upon ourselves because of idolatry. And I looked and I go, well, what are our idols? We have idolatry of entertainment, politicians, comfort, family, and I can't remember the other one that I journaled. And I really looked and I was like, man, those really apply to me. So how can we fix that? How can we change that in our lives? We have judgment in our lives because we are putting false idols in our lives. So what are we going to do about that? What am I going to do about that? How am I going to change my life when I read scripture? I've lost my train of thought so many times, but I've realized that I am growing. My view on the world is changing as I read scripture, not as I read news. How I'm going to vote and where I'm going to put my faith and the peace that I have during this election comes from the Bible, not a single lick of news that I read. And I don't care who gets elected because it's God. God's going to be the one that's going to bring peace to this land. And there's some movie that talks about the Trump prophecy. Oh my goodness. And God's going to bring healing to this land. And they're like, through Trump. And I'm, woosah. We're going to end right there. Because